Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the Badan Warisan Malaysia talk series for Spotlight on Sarawak, also known as Talk Sarawak. Today is the sixth and final installment of our six-part talk on Sarawak's unique and diverse heritage. Spotlight on Sarawak was organized in conjunction with World Heritage Day 2022 and is curated by our live members, Tan Sri Moggie and Puan Elizabeth, with the support of leading academics and heritage specialists from Malaysia and beyond. We're extremely grateful that we were able to present this program in partnership with Petra Energy, supported by donors Creador Foundation, Cahaya Mata Sarawak Malay Berhad, Cope Private Equity Sdn Berhad, and Centric PR Sdn Berhad. As the president of Badan Warisan Malaysia, I have the privilege today to introduce you to Puan Elizabeth Moggie, the moderator for today's webinar. She will also officially close our Talk Sarawak series today, which we have been very, very proud to organize and host. Puan Sri Datin Amar Elizabeth Moggie was born and educated in New Zealand. She has a BA degree in History and Political Science from the University of Auckland and was a history and English teacher at St. Joseph's Boys Secondary School in Kuching, Sarawak, from 1968 to 1976. She's married to Tan Sri Dato' Amalia Moggie, a former Member of Parliament for Kanawit and Federal Cabinet Member. There are 5 children, 9 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. Her main interests are 20th century Malaysian history, particularly the World War II period and its aftermath, the history of Sarawak, and the conservation and preservation of Malaysians' built heritage. She also enjoys classical music, art and craft appreciation, reading and walking. Puan Sri Elizabeth is a live member of Badan Warisan Malaysia, member of Malayan Volunteers Group, a member of the Malaysian branch of the Royal Asiatic Society, and is a supporter of the SPCA, the Slang Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, and is also a member of the Sarawak Heritage Society. Thank you for having done us the honor of being our moderator today.
Oh, thank you for that introduction. It's a great honor to be here today, and it's a particular honor and a privilege to be involved in this series. I think my husband Leo and I, we had a better appreciation of our state after having looked at this series. And I hand back to you to introduce James Yong, who is our speaker today.
Thank you so much, Ms. Willis. And now I'm honored to introduce James Yong, who is today's speaker on Sarawak's endangered heritage. James S.L. Yong is currently president of the Sarawak Heritage Society, SHS. SHS is a non-government, non-partisan and non-profit organization focused on raising awareness of Sarawak's heritage and advocating for its sustainable conservation and safeguarding. James is a member of the Sarawak Heritage Council, which was formed to advise the government on matters of policy, strategy, or plan of action relating to the administration and management of heritage and conservation areas in Sarawak. He's presently researching a book on the history of Padungan, an important heritage area in Kuching, Sarawak. He also facilitates a UNESCO masterclass on heritage site management, and his FB group, Kuching Then and Now, has more than 25,000 members. He's also an advocate for sustainable heritage management, animal rights, and Sarawak history education. When not working in heritage matters, James Yong runs JY Global Associates, an independent consultant outfit, which focuses on strategy, tech management, business models, and process streamlining for organizations. So I would like to now introduce James Yong. Over to you, James.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Waylin. Good day to everybody, and thank you for taking time to attend this talk on Sarawak's endangered heritage. I'm privileged to have been invited to give this talk. And frankly, to tell you the truth, when I was preparing for it, I actually did not realize the breadth of this topic because it's so rich, it's so detailed, and it's got so many areas that to do justice to this subject, I had to make some decisions and choose representative examples and concepts that would showcase to you the ideas and the issues behind endangerment of our heritage. So let me begin very quickly now by sharing with you this quotation. And the quotation goes, our heritage is not only being increasingly threatened by the natural causes of decay, but also by economic and social changes. Now, you may be thinking, what an obvious statement for us to make today in the 21st century, in the year 2022. But the thing is that this statement was made in 1983. It was made by none other than the late Datuk Lucas Chin, the former director of the Sarawak Museum, a good friend of my father. I used to call him Uncle Lucas. And he wrote it in the Sarawak Museum Journal in August 1983. So even 40 years ago, he was already concerned that our heritage was being increasingly threatened. Fast forward to 2022, and you can imagine that we are facing even greater issues, and we may have already lost some of the heritage that existed during his time. My agenda is quite simple. I have 5 main areas. The first 3 I will tend to cover relatively quickly and focus more on the number 4 and number 5. I will start by clarifying the terms of what we are talking about, Sarawak endangered heritage. I will ask the obvious question of why do we preserve our heritage? I want to also then talk a little bit, very briefly, about heritage conservation and the evolving approaches of heritage conservation. Then we go into what specific Sarawak heritage is under threat and what should be done. So let's start with clarifying the terms. So I don't want to assume that everybody in this call, in this webinar, is familiar and intimately familiar with Sarawak. I know that there are already many overseas visitors who may be interested in Sarawak, but maybe not as familiar. So let me just offer a welcome to you to Sarawak and introduce what we are. Sarawak is a state or territory of Malaysia. It's in fact the largest, with an area of 125,000 square kilometers. It has 12 divisions, supporting a population of almost 3 million people. Within this, we have more than 30 ethnic groups and more than 45 different dialects or sub-ethnic groups. And this creates a very rich culture for us, many rich traditions, customs, art, music, practices, languages. We also have a very interesting history, which I will not touch on here because there's a slide later that touches on our history. And Sarawak has, in the area of 125,000 square kilometers, more than about 60% are forested. And within those forests, we have a very extensive biodiversity. Second term is heritage. What is heritage? You all probably have your own intuitive understanding of what heritage is, or you may have read some definition in some texts or books or Google. But I like this particular one in the box. Heritage is what we have inherited from our ancestors, that which we enjoy and value in our times, and which we choose to pass on to our future generations. I first heard this one from one of the UNESCO conferences some years back. And it's interesting to me because the first line talks about things that we have inherited from our forefathers. The second line talks about how we use it in our lifetimes. And the third one has 2 points, that we are passing it on to our future generations, and also that it is a choice. We choose what we want to pass on. The second quotation there I will not go into is by a very well-known anthropologist and historian called Mr. Ashworth, Sir Ashworth. And his definition also includes, towards the end, deliberate choice. The choice of what heritage we pass on to future generations is not by chance survival, but by deliberate choice. Standard subdivisions or subcategorization of heritage tends to look like this. You may have seen it in different papers or books. You talk about cultural heritage, you talk about natural heritage, and you talk about a mix of the two. And within cultural heritage, you talk about tangible and intangible. And you can go further. Tangible could be movable, immovable, or underwater. And intangible, if I use the UNESCO definition, the 5 points on top, from oral traditions up to traditional craftsmanship, comes from UNESCO's convention. And most of us have tacked on a 6th one on heritage food anyway. I wouldn't read this, but I think you kind of understand what tangible cultural heritage is the things that we can see and touch, like archaeological sites or monuments or buildings or artifacts and objects, which are of heritage significance. Intangible cultural heritage includes those practices, expressions, knowledge, skills, and the rest that you can't touch per se, but you can observe. Although intangible cultural heritage, I will hasten to add, will always have a tangible component to it. And finally, natural heritage comprises things like natural features, geological or physiographical formations, natural sites, and our flora and fauna, animals and plants. And finally, the third term in the title, what does endangered mean? Well, usually endangered is used to describe plant and animal species which are not doing well, perhaps near the point of extinction. And extending the term to heritage, it refers to threats that may cause our heritage assets to be destroyed, diminish, or eventually disappear. Endangered heritage, the term itself can be quite fluid and subjective because it depends on who you ask. One community's definition of endangered heritage may be slightly different from another community's. Different people have different priorities. Different categories of threats that endanger our heritage, I've categorized it into 3: nature, man, and systems. And I have this simple diagram to show it. For instance, for nature, I think instinctively you would agree with me that how nature creates threats to heritage could be through things like fire, lightning. We are lucky that Borneo, we don't have volcanic eruptions, hurricanes, storms, typhoons, floods, soil erosion, climatic change, and obviously we have all lived through more than 2 years of pandemic. From a human aspect, I think the first one that pops out at me always is apathy, people being just indifferent to heritage being there or not being there. That leads often to neglect, decay of the heritage, vandalism, deliberate destruction, urbanization, the movement of people from the rural to the cities or towns is a big cause to rural heritage particularly. Modernity and lifestyle changes is another cause of the loss of some heritage. The change in our religious environment, the adoption of a new religion, for instance, new beliefs, may result in discarding of some heritage. Insensitive property development, real estate, for instance, building a new parking lot, whatever, in a place which has heritage significance could also be a threat. And of course, depletion of natural resources, deforestation through logging and other means, depletion of raw materials, obviously deprives us of a lot of things that we consider our natural heritage. And of course, war and civil conflict. The third category under systems is like, for instance, policies and regulatory framework of the state. If it's not adequate or it's gaps in certain areas, that can cause heritage to be threatened. Poor maintenance, poor enforcement, economic priorities, giving more economic priority to perhaps building new buildings, new shopping centers and whatever, over preserving an older building or a heritage site is again a threat. Ownership issues, whether it's of a heritage building, a heritage site, or a heritage area, could also cause problems. Of course, the fact that we have too few heritage professionals at work may also cause problems, but it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. And finally, uncontrolled tourism can, as you have read in the papers or in the media, obviously, has caused a lot of problems to heritage sites which have become tourist magnets. So let's move to the second section, why preserve our heritage? Well, I'll make a simple statement. Sarawak is special. Those of us who live in Sarawak already know that. Those of us who have an affinity or have traveled to Sarawak would have discovered that. And I think Sarawak's rich and unique heritage comes from the fact that there's this confluence of at least 4 main factors that I can discern. The first one, our rich history. Second one, our multi-ethnicity. I talked about 30 over different ethnic groups. The third one, our cultural fusion. Despite the fact that we have so many ethnic groups, we interact with each other so much. We celebrate each other's culture. We visit each other on festival days. And that blending, there's a lot of intermarriages as well. And that blending of culture creates something unique and rich. And finally, our biodiversity, which I'll talk about a bit later. I don't want to go into all these four, but I want to touch a little bit on our rich history, because for those who are not as familiar, I think this will be interesting. Now, this is a very busy slide, and it's deliberately so, because once I was asked to give a talk about Sarawak history to the group of young people, and being too lazy to create a whole deck of slides, I created one slide. And this slide sustained me through 1.5 or 2 hours of presentation on Sarawak history. And it's quite interesting. Let me run through it quickly for you, starting from the top left-hand corner. The first 2 images you see there are related to Sarawak's prehistory, before the writing of the recording of history. The Nia Caves, for instance, archaeologists have done a lot of work there, and we have found that earliest settlement of man in Sarawak was between 30,000 to 65,000 years ago. Bongki Sam is another area in Santubong where archaeological work has been done, and they found that there were settlements there related to Santubong as a port, and there were ironworks there, there were some religious shrines there, all way back to 13th, 14th, 15th century as well. The second group, I think I just put some characters that you may have read about, who were prominent in the early history of Sarawak. The Sultan of Brunei, because Sarawak in the beginning was part of the Brunei Sultanate, albeit a very lightly governed one because it was so far away, until the discovery of gold and antimony in Sarawak, at which point the Sultan sent a governor called Mahkota, and then also his uncle called Raja Muda Hashim to govern Sarawak. And that led to the locals being unhappy with the heavy-handedness of the rule, and they rebel. And there was a rebellion in the years leading up to 1840. And there was a point when a young British adventurer called James Brooke came on his ship to visit Sarawak, to visit Kuching in particular. As history would have it, that led to James Brooke helping in the suppression of the rebellion. I wouldn't go into any details. And he was made governor and later Raja of Sarawak. And that began a 105-year rule of the Brooke family of Sarawak. It's a very interesting story. After James Brooke passed away, it was passed on to his nephew, Charles Brooke, and after that to his nephew's son, Charles Viner Brooke. So 1841 to 1946, we had 105 years of Brooke rule. This, of course, was punctuated for 3.5 years by the Japanese occupation between December 1941 to September 1945. It was hard times, dark times. People had lots of hardships, but we survived, and I think we got stronger because of it. And after the Japanese occupation was over, Charles Viner Brooke decided to cede Sarawak to Britain. So we became a British colony between 1946 and 1963. That shows the signing of the agreement. And after that, Sarawak, North Borneo, which is now called Sabah, Singapore, and the Federation of Malaya formed the new Federation of Malaysia on September the 16th, 1963. So I don't know how long I took there, but you just had a potted history of Sarawak over the last maybe 200 years. In the run-up to this talk, I thought it was a good idea for me to ask some of my friends what their views were. Why do we preserve Sarawak heritage? And this is a sampling of some of their feedback. I'll let you read it for yourself. I wouldn't read everything, but I will just touch on 1 or 2 which I found very interesting. One is it preserves our history. Another one keeps our integrity as a people. Losing our heritage is like losing the soul of our people. And another one said, that it shared roots, shared values, shared destiny. That's the reason why we preserve our heritage. And of course, somebody also said a rich heritage can help our tourism sector. So these are very diverse views, but I think there's a commonality in what they are expressing. Let's now move to the third section, a very brief section, only 2 or 3 slides, on heritage conservation, because you can't talk about heritage without talking about what we want to do with it, whether it's to conserve the heritage, to protect the heritage, or to safeguard the heritage. And rather than leave you with the impression that that is a static thing, I want to share with you that it's an evolving approach. But before that, on the left-hand side of the screen, I share some general principles of heritage conservation. These are probably quite commonsensical. They try to obviously preserve the historical condition of the thing that you're trying to preserve or conserve. You try to maintain authenticity, not put new materials from the different time frame and mess up the whole historic condition. You want it to have integrity, meaning you don't interfere too much, minimal intervention, maintain cultural traditions, use appropriate technology, and be prepared for disaster. And the best example for this is the disaster that happened in Paris, France a few years ago, and there was a fire at the Notre Dame Cathedral. And it was clear how they were quite prepared because a lot of plans, historic plans came up, so they could actually rebuild the parts which were burned. Ask ourselves, if some of our key heritage in Kuching, in Sarawak, were burned down, would we be as well prepared to restore it? Let's move on to the right-hand side, and you see 3 kind of overlapping arrows. And this is meant to represent the evolution of the different approaches to heritage conservation. Let's start with the first one on the left, the material-based approach, which was actually the approach that started this whole movement of conservation. It started in the probably 40s, 50s, and 60s, and it started very much in Europe after the Great Wars, where they saw a huge amount of their old buildings, historical buildings and heritage structures having been destroyed by conflict, by the war and conflict. And a group of people came together and formed this movement to conserve what was still left standing. And that became the material-based approach. Their focus was very much preservation of the past with very strict attachment to material conservation, the authenticity part I spoke about. It was a top-down approach, and it was a very much expert-driven approach by government officials and heritage conservationists. And they focused mainly on the historical values and the aesthetic values of the heritage they were trying to conserve. They did not include the community at all. Then, moving on to the 80s, 90s, and beyond, people started to look at heritage and why isn't the community involved? The community should have a very big stake in how they view the heritage asset, the structure, the building, whatsoever. So the values considered expanded to include more perspectives, especially from the stakeholders in the community. And this included, in addition to the historical and aesthetic ones, cultural values, social values, spiritual values, symbolic values, or even scientific or technical values. So you started looking at your heritage item or potential heritage item from a more holistic view. In more recent years, especially after 2000, I think the conservation movement people have been looking at heritage in a much broader perspective, and they call this the living heritage perspective. And it's now trying to safeguard the community's connection with the heritage site or building or item, because conservation then does not aim solely at preserving the fabric of the place, but at maintaining the continuity that the community has with their heritage place. Let me give you an example that cuts across all 3. It's a generic example from India, a temple in one of the states of India. It was a temple which was a few hundred years old or more, and it was a temple that basically was right in the middle of a town, a village that grew into a town, that grew into a city. So the first stage of material-based conservation, the people were focused mainly on the building itself, the structure of the building itself, the temple, to make sure that they try to restore it back to what its former glory was. So they did a lot of research of what it might have looked like in the past, and they brought in materials which are quite similar and tried to plaster up the place to make it look like that. Then the local community said, we were here before you conservation experts came. We have other views about this building that I think you should take into account. So then the values-based approach was kind of introduced, and they expanded to include more stakeholders in that city so that they could give their views why this temple meant to them in terms of a cultural aspect, social aspect, spiritual aspect, and so forth. Later on, groups of traders started moving into the temple area and setting up stalls and selling things there. So the temple area became quite a bustling area for people, for the community. And the conservationists, the strict conservationists, found that there was a problem now that, yes, you could cordon off the place and try to restrict it from the community, and you get resentment from the community, or you could open it to the community and try to come to some compromise on how we can preserve some of the fabric, but at the same time allow the place to be used as a community area the way that it has been for years before. Yeah, so that was a community-based. So you can see with this example how we have transitioned, how we have evolved from a material-based approach to values-based approach to living heritage approach. Another concept that I just wanted to leave you with before I leave this section is on this thing, what I call a sliding window perspective of heritage. Some of us may think that, oh, this is our heritage and we will remember it forever. But life doesn't work like that. I mean, all of us come through life, we have a certain amount of time, and what we see as heritage is, in effect, a kind of a sliding window perspective over time. And the time could be years, decades, centuries, generations. What we see basically are the things that we remember or the things that we can find from books. But there will come a time when some of our heritage is just forgotten by the community and left and not recorded, and you will move on. And as you move on, there will be new buildings that you build, there'll be new writings that you do, there'll be new songs that you compose, there'll be new books that you write that slowly become part of your newly adopted heritage. This is a natural process, and there's nothing we can do about it, but I think it's good to have this realization that heritage evolves with us. So now let's come to the meat of today's presentation. What Sarawak heritage is under threat. Let me leave you for a while to take in these pictures that I've assembled for you. Those of you who are familiar with Sarawak, in particular who are familiar with Kuching, would recognize some of this. Well, I guess if you are of my vintage, you definitely recognize. If you're slightly younger, you may have read about it or seen pictures of it in books. Top left, we have the wet markets on Jalan Gambir. The Jalan Gambir used to have a whole row of wet markets, vegetable, chicken, poultry, meat, and so on and so forth. The top middle is the government rest house, which was an elevated part of central Kuching, overlooking the Sarawak Museum. The old St. Joseph's Church, I remember very well because I think I attended Mass there until I was about 10 years old. Kuching Central Prison was off Jalan Tabuan. And the Old Tan Mansion, I think very few of you would probably have seen it in its physical form. I haven't, but it was in a very prominent place in Padungan. And if I tell you where it was demolished to build the Odeon Cinema and Arcade. And later, the Odeon Cinema and Arcade was also demolished. And now on that spot, you have a high-rise building being built that I hear will become a hotel. But what happened to all this? Well, this happened to all this. Some were demolished, some were burnt down, some were deliberately left to fall apart. And this, I think, is part of our lost heritage. Let me give you another selection of pictures. And this one may provoke some interesting thinking. Let me first focus on the tangible heritage here. Like, for instance, the top middle picture, the Miri Long Jetty. I was born in Miri. I didn't live there too long, but I think I vaguely have memories of walking down part or being carried down part of this jetty. It was about a mile long. It was built by Shell and the government, I believe, and it was because in times of stormy weather, the ships could not come close to the Miri Peninsula, and they had to discharge their cargo and passengers, who would then walk along the jetty to to the land. It was then we have the Rex Cinema, where I spent many of my errand youthful days in watching the silver screen. And this was at what is called Jalan, between Jalan Wayang and Jalan the Temple Street today. Bottom left, you have the old Secretariat and Treasury building, which is on Jalan Barak, next to the Central Police Station. And on the bottom right, you have the Drinking Horse Rock Formation in Miri. What happened to these? Again, some were demolished, some were dismantled, and some collapsed on its own. I just want to say a few brief words about the other two diagrams. The elongated earlobes was something that we saw a lot being exemplified by the Kayans, I think, the Kayan community. And it had certain status symbol. It was also probably a fashion statement of sorts to have elongated earlobes, but we don't see it anymore. And I just wanted you to reflect on that and to see how changing times have changed the people's appearance as well. And the practice of head hunting, I just wanted to put this there as a provocation, because let's face it, it happened, and it's our history and it's our heritage. And heritage doesn't mean that you would propagate it, but it doesn't mean you forget it either. So now, having talked about the heritage which is gone, is lost, join me on a whirlwind tour of our existing heritage which is still around, well, somewhat. And those of you who are perceptive will notice that the little symbol with a swirly line behind is what they call a bungai terong, which is a symbol which is quite popular for Iban tattoos, I believe. And it's got connections with this thing called Berani Berjalai, which is to walk in bravery or a journey of freedom, knowledge, and wisdom. So let's start our very rapid journey of wisdom and knowledge with this whirlwind tour. And while you're thinking about it, I just want you to reflect yourself. What are the threats, and have they come from nature, from human, or from systems? Let's start with the buildings which were built during the Brooke and the colonial era. Remember, we are talking about 130, 140 years of Sarawak history here. I think most of you who are Sarawakians or are familiar with Sarawak would recognize all of these buildings. James Brooke wasn't much of a builder, or at least the buildings that he did build during his time did not survive. But Charles Brooke was built. I think most of these structures here were built during Charles Brooke's time. Viner Brooke built commissioned the General Post Office on the bottom left. But when we look at these buildings today, all of them, I'm happy to say, are gazetted, which means they have been passed in Parliament to be put on the Heritage Register, and in theory, they are under government protection. And people who do damage or who damage the fabric, you can check in the Heritage Ordinance, will face some punitive measures. But I still feel with the ordinance, we also need to pay more attention to what conservation needs all these buildings have. It's tough. As we have more and more of such heritage buildings, there will be more and more to maintain and conserve. But it's an exercise that I think we should take accountability for, and we should continue to propagate. Some heritage buildings, however, in the Heritage Ordinance, you're supposed to have a buffer zone whereby around any heritage building, you're not supposed to build something too close. I think we have played free and easy with some of these. I wouldn't go into examples, but some of the buffer zones in some of our heritage sites have been compromised. I think there is obviously a need to think about repurposing and adaptive reuse for some of these. Like, for instance, the old courthouse is no more a courthouse. Obviously, it has to be repurposed and used for a different function, whether it's cafes or restaurants or boutique shops or, mini museums that we have. I think these are decisions that have to be made and to be creatively made so that we can innovatively make use of and repurpose all these heritage buildings in a way that they will still bring value to the society and the community today. So endangered, I leave it to you. Move now to traditional dwellings. And I think in this case, I'm just taking a sample of 3 different ethnic groups. the Malay style, the Chinese style, and the Iban or the Dayak in general, longhouses. For the Malay style buildings, and I grew up in an era where we used to visit Malay friends in the kampongs over Raya or over marriages, marriage invitations. And we always could see lots and lots of these Malay style buildings, which are invariably on stilts, wooden in most cases, will have ornate carvings on the veranda, on the staircase, on the windows, or on the edges of the roof. And you don't see very many of that nowadays, I guess. I've shown two examples, which are relatively good examples, actually. One is the Darul Mazia on Kampong number 6, if I'm not mistaken, and Rumah Batu, which is just next to the Divisional Mosque. Moving on to the Chinese dwellings, and in this case, I actually picked mansions, so I guess it will be the relatively wealthy tycoons who built this. One is the Chan Mansion, which is situated on the edge of Sekama and Pedungan roads. It was owned by one of the offspring, or one of the children, descendants of Chan Ko, one of the earliest Chow An pioneers in Sarawak. And the other building is the former home of Ong Yu Hai, which then became part of the Anglican mission as a boarding school for St. Mary's, and later now, and currently now, is the Marion Hotel in Kuching. It's quite well preserved as well. Then moving on to the right-hand side, you see two examples of longhouses. One, the top photo provided to me by a friend, Louis Jab, on Murat Longhouse along the Skrang River. And the other one you may recognize as the Bidayuh Longhouse at Ana Rayas. Now, what are the issues facing heritage here? Okay, these we can consider probably as heritage architecture or heritage dwellings. Well, the methods of construction, in some cases, they didn't even use nails. In the case of, Malay houses or early Chinese houses, they used, various joints, mortise and tenon and so forth. They were definitely unique designs that we don't see much any longer. And because we don't see this any longer, it's sensible to deduce that there are fewer skilled craftsmen who can do this anymore because there's not much need. Then there's changes in modernity, changes in lifestyle that cause people, the community who used to live in these houses, to move away, especially in the case of the longhouses. And then there's fire danger, which I'll talk about later in the next slide. Endangered. Well, this is a short piece of writing by my friend Karen Shepherd in the Kino magazine, in the article, A Tale of Two Longhouses. And I like it very much because she basically states the key points of what I'm trying to express here, that the traditional longhouse is vanishing along with traditional lifestyles. You can read the rest. And also the other thing that's negative also is that images of wooden longhouses consumed in flames go up on social media with depressing regularity. Even in the past 3 years, I've read with dismay how many longhouses have gone up in flames and how many people have been displaced and homeless, and the state and the community had to step in. But in the next paragraph, she also mentions that in reality, longhouses were rarely designed to last. Yes, one may not realize that the Iban community, for instance, was practiced shifting cultivation, and Sweden agriculture, I think they call it as well. And basically they worked a piece of land, and when it was depleted, the community would actually move to another area where they would have to rebuild another longhouse. But nonetheless, whether it's supposed to be shifting or static, I think the archetype of the longhouse is something that we treasure in Sarawak. And I think we should basically make efforts to retain these structures, either in situ, basically where they are today, restore them to some form that they were before, or transplant them to an area like the Sarawak Cultural Village or other places like that, where they can be preserved and showcased for people who may be interested to know how people live in the days past. There are still quite a number of longhouses in Sarawak, obviously, but if you go there and see them for yourself, you would find that if you had been brought up like I did, reading old texts, history texts or geography texts showing the archetypal longhouses, you'll be kind of disappointed because they would now look more like a bit like a terrace house or some modern house. And yes, you miss the old archetypes of that. But at the same time, you have to realize, and I always ask my friends who say, oh, the longhouses are so beautiful and all that, I ask them, would you like to live in one of those yourself? And you cannot blame anybody for wanting all the modern amenities of electricity and water and Netflix to be in where they live, right? So we have to balance the requirements. And obviously for the fire hazards, we have to do something either through ordinance or regulation to ensure that the longhouses that we do have and the communities who live within there are well protected with fire doors and other precautionary measures that can prevent future fiery disasters. Let me move very quickly along. Places of worship, and I share here 4 examples. Top left, you have the Masjid Al-Qadim in Cebu, one of the oldest mosques that you have in Sarawak, actually. And on the same line, on the right-hand side, you see St. James's Church in Kampong Kuop, about 10th mile from Kuching. At the bottom, you see the Tua Pekong Temple, which I think most people know, at the end of Main Bazaar, which is, I think, quite undeniably the oldest Chinese temple in Sarawak. But the years where it was constructed are kind of unclear, because it has gone from, I've seen dates of 1871, 1843, even 1770. And the last one is the Indian Mosque on Lorong Sempit, which is a little lane that connects India Street and Gambia Street. And there's a mosque there. And let me tell you what happened to all of these. The question again we ask is, are they endangered? Well, let's start with the easy one. The way that the Chinese community generally works is that they would upgrade the mosque from time to time using donations or grants or whatever from the community or from patrons. And this particular temple, Tua Pekong Temple, I think has been upgraded probably half a dozen times or more. And if you see very old pictures of Tua Pekong Temple back in the early 1900s, is very different from what you see now. Masjid Al-Qadim, I'm happy to say, underwent a 4 to 5 year construction where it was closed and only reopened this year. One of my friends, a conservation architect by the name of Mr. Dr. Madhya Haris, was involved in this conservation project, and I think it's in good shape at the moment. The Indian mosque, I've found, is now being used for religious education because the community for prayers and everything have mainly moved to the new mosque, which has been built on the edge of the Sarawak River, what we usually call the floating mosque, which was opened about 2 years ago. St. James Church, a church which was built in 1865, and if you think about it, during the time of the first Raja, James Brooke, is still standing, a billion-built structure. If you go in there, it's a really surreal experience because you're walking back in time. Unfortunately, its structure could be a little bit shaky today. The structural integrity needs to be examined. It has been gazetted, but I think more attention needs to be put into restoring it, reinforcing it, and ensuring it becomes a place that people can go and visit. The community has actually built a new church right next to it and use that for all their masses and all their religious activities. And this is just used for very light activities like rehearsals, for the youth singing and all that stuff. But it's not used for massive groups of people anymore. So issues relating to this are similar to what I've described before. You need to factor in the costs for maintenance and repairs. Who's going to fund that? You need to factor in the need for more modern facilities. You need to cater for the changes in the expectations of the faithful who frequent these churches. And as the designs change, there will be a shortage of skilled craftsmen who are able to do the older designs. Another quick one on places of learning, and I picked 3 examples. The one on the left is something that you may recognize today as the Islamic Heritage Museum on Jalan P. Ramlee. It was originally built during the time of, I think, Raja Charles Spiner Brooke, and it was built as a Malay college called the James Brooke Malay College, later changed to Madrasah Melayu Sarawak. And later on again in 1992, it was the school moved and the school activity moved, and it became the Malay Islamic Heritage Museum. And for those who have not visited, I would urge you to do so. Then St. Joseph's School, my alma mater actually, this is what you see in front is the Mill Hill block, has undergone restoration work through donations from both government and private donors, and restoration work was completed in 2021. The old Hokkien School was built also when the Chinese community started to pay attention to how they could create a Chinese education system for the local Chinese here, because it was built around 1911, and 1911 is a very significant year if you know your Chinese history, because 1911, 1912 was where the Chinese Revolution took place. The Qing dynasty fell and become a republic. And, you know, previously, it was quite easy for the richer, more affluent Chinese people to send their children to China for tertiary education. But China started going through these massive changes. And in 1949, when it became the People's Republic of China, when the communists took over, it became very uncertain whether you could actually go back to China. You probably could go back, but you couldn't come back to Sarawak anymore. So the Chinese community started having discussions on how do you provide a Chinese education system in Sarawak itself. I just want to spend a minute or two on heritage shop houses. I call it heritage shop houses. These are not gazetted by any means, but if you look at the main bazaar, this was the bazaar which James Brooke recorded that he observed when he actually arrived in Kuching in 1839, 1841. It was already there, obviously in a more primitive form, but it has evolved through the years, and you can see the photo at the top, which is a 1960s version, and the 2000s version of the main bazaar in the bottom photo. The concern here is this heritage? Is this endangered? The concern, I think, here from me, I think, and from the society at least, is that we need to take care of the streetscape. Some places have done it better than others. The traditional streetscape of the traditional bazaar like this, a street like this, sometimes is preserved in a way that there are no incompatible or unsightly additions to the streetscape. Imagine a 10-story or 7-story hotel suddenly sprouting up when your other roof lines are only 2 or 3 stories, you know. I think we also lack a clear do's and don'ts or guidelines for what can be modified, what can be renovated. Yeah, we have not really drawn out those guidelines. Aesthetic values are obviously very subjective. Different people have different preferences, what they want. But I don't think anybody likes to see a lot of air conditioner condensers in the front of their building. Lack of enforcement, which is also a problem when you don't have the guidelines in the first place. And I also pose the question, is it time for us to think about creating a heritage precinct? Maybe it's not possible to preserve all of it, but could we carve out an area that we create as a heritage precinct and impose some rulings on there with government support and incentives or whatever to try to preserve it in a way that reflects the elegance of these bazaars in times gone by. Let me change gears very quickly now and talk about the Iban Puah Kumbu. Some of you may know that the Puah Kumbu is a hand-woven warp ikat textile, which, well, represents the quintessence of Iban culture. It is, depending on the design, historical archive, mythological or religious story, or a personal tale. It says a lot about the weaver and her relationship with the spirits. This is a paragraph I took out from one of the old papers about the Puah Kumbu. I talked to a lot of friends because I'm no expert at Puah Kumbu, although I admire the designs and all that. And I asked them, do you think the Puah Kumbu is endangered? And I had a lot of differing opinions. Some say yes, some say definitely no. And I think it boils down to how you perceive the Puah Kumbu. If you perceive the Puah Kumbu as just a piece of cloth, a piece of, albeit a very well-designed cloth, You could argue that it's not endangered because we still have weavers, we still have craftsmen, and perhaps in time we will even have automation to create wakumbus. So how can you say it's endangered when you can recreate it? But if you look at wakumbu as a tradition, which meaning encompassing the rituals, the inspiration, if you read the Sarawak Gazette, for instance, or other history books, you know that the early weavers drew inspiration from dreams or omens or other divine intervention to create the designs for the wakumbu. How the wakumbu featured in the designs, the rituals, and how the weaver status in the longhouse, the woman who could weave a wakumbu could raise their status. The Ibans are a very egalitarian society. The men and the women are equal, but each have to prove their worth. The men as warriors, the women perhaps as weavers or other makers of creative products. So if you take all this together, we definitely do not have the wakumbu tradition in the way that it was before. But let me just say again, I'm no expert on this, but I look at it as an objective observer, as it were. Remember I told you of this value-based approach to conservation? I think that's a nice methodology to apply to this whole concept of wakumbu, because if you look at it from all these values perspective, whether from the historical values, aesthetic values, symbolic, cultural, social, spiritual, you can come up with a very decent write-up on what actually makes up the wakumbu, not just the cloth itself, but the whole process of making it. And I think, I hope you'll get access to these slides because I know you cannot read the words I've put on there. But it's just my interpretation or my assessment or my review of what the wakumbu is. And I certainly believe, from my point of view at least, that it should be part of our Sarawak heritage. Moving along quickly again on to Orang Ulu carving. The Orang Ulu, it comprises of many ethnic groups, including the Kenya, the Kayan, the Kajang, Punan, Brawan, and many others, were among the most skilled and decorative carvers in Sarawak. And they produce a whole range of beautiful wood carvings, from huge barrel structures, like the one you see on the right-hand side, which is called a clearing or barrel post, to panels on doors, to effigies, this hudok kelunan, and to even hornbill ivory earrings that the man on the left is carving. Issues that relate to some of these, I guess you might have read in the media that there's been a group of people, including one of my friends, Dr. Elena Chai, who is spearheading this effort to preserve more of the clearings which have kind of been discarded by the local communities, because as the communities move to modernity or they adopt new religions, some of these are obviously not seen to be appropriate, and some villages have discarded it. And the idea is to preserve as many of these as we can, and if not able to bring it to a central place, then to be able to record the designs and the way that it was built and so on and so forth. So that's the clearing issue. Changes in societal effects, external influences, new religions, leading to fewer skilled craftsmen, and urbanization, when the craftsmen go into the cities or the towns to seek employment and leave the carving behind. I know this is a very superficial overview of this, but I just wanted to share with you this element. And in fact, in the paper I told you about that Dr. Lucas Chin was writing about, lamenting about, he also spoke very much about the Orang Ulu carving tradition, which was diminishing even back in 1987. We're endangered. We can also observe various vanishing traits which are disappearing. Anything from the blacksmith of Kuching, which is a subject that I'm researching on and trying to do a little photo book on, to the tinsmith that we still have a couple in Kuching and other parts of other towns within Sarawak. Once upon a time, we could go to the shop to get people to make furniture for us using rattan. A picture on the top left here, a rattan maker. And there was a time when we had Malay communities, even along the Sarawak River, who were master boat builders and who could build a boat, a prahu, or a tambang or whatever. But I think these are becoming fewer and far between. And it's because of economic changes, it's because of automation, machines that can make the same things, modern substitutes, changes in the demands of society. Next generation not keen is a refrain that I hear a lot when we talk to the elder artisans. They say, oh, my children are not interested anymore and they're working in other things. And the skills are gradually being lost. Can we save this? I'm not sure. Perhaps we can, perhaps we can't, or perhaps we just need to document and record this so that we know that once upon a time we had such a trait. Most definitely disappearing, in my opinion. The whole area of music, dance, and performing arts is a huge area that I will not have time to go in, but I just share some photographs to just spark your imagination, your memories. I've been involved a little bit with some of the Chinese operatic troops, trying to get them gigs and opportunities to perform. They still do in certain temples, more for celebrations relating to the deity. But you can see that the average age of the troop members, 60 plus, 70, and you know that it's a matter of time before this culture disappears. On the top left-hand side, you see some musical instruments that we used to have a lot more of, the selingwood or the nose flute, for instance, and other instruments that were made in Sarawak, but you don't see them anymore. And I think the number of people who are able to play these devices, these instruments, is also diminishing. Then you have the performing arts like dances, Ngajat, the Rajang Ba'u, which is the eagle dance of the Bidayu, the hornbill dance of the Kenya, or even expressions like the Malay pantun or the chants of different ethnic groups or ritual dirge. All these are all kind of disappearing, or if not disappearing, they are evolving. I was quite amused and happy one time when I attended a performance during our WAK, What About Kuching Festival, where a group of young people started doing rap talking, in the form of a modernized version of pantun, a Malay pantun. And I felt that perhaps this is the way that art form is gradually evolving towards. If the modern generation, new generation adopts it as such and adapts it into a form that they are more happy with, then that may be the way to go. Evolving or endangerment. There are so many areas that I wish I had time to mention in this talk. I know I'm already running out of time. Beadwork, basketry, ceramics, songket and Keringkam, of which there's a very nice gallery in Kuching that I hope some of you visit. Festivals is a huge topic, whether it's Gawai or whether it's the Milano Festival. Tattoos is another area. Disappearing languages and war memories. I mean, heritage from the dark days during the Japanese occupation. Then on natural heritage, I'm only going to share this one slide. I think these are the kind of the poster children that you see on a lot of brochures. The orangutan, the big-nosed proboscis monkey, the rhinoceros hornbill, and other flora and fauna that are endangered lists of various organizations. And of course, you also see natural sites like Santubong, which is so rich in culture and heritage and history, from the Santubong port, the archaeological sites, to places like where Wallace wrote his papers, to other history areas, as well as Gunung Mulu, which obviously is a UNESCO World Heritage Site today. So Sarawak is blessed with a lot of this existing flora and fauna and natural sites, and we should each play our part to kind of preserve this as far as we can. So that leads us to the fifth section, what needs to be done. Let's take stock first of what we have done relatively well. And this list, which I'm not going to go through in full, talks about some of them. We recently enacted the Sarawak Heritage Ordinance 2019. It was passed through the Dun in 2019, and it was enacted only in March the 1st this year. And it's a continuation of previous ordinances that we had, the Antiquities Ordinance, the Sarawak Cultural Heritage Ordinance 1993, and now this. each of which building and improving on the previous one. Is it perfect? By no means. I think there are lots of gaps. There are lots of areas that we should have included in it, but it's an improvement. And I think we can use it as a basis for progress, as something to build on through further amendments and new legislation. We have added more entries. We have gazetted more items, basically, into our Sarawak Heritage Register. The RCBMH stands for Royal Charles Brooke Memorial Hospital, St. James Church in Kuala, which I mentioned earlier, the Santubong archaeological sites. All these and others were gazetted in 2019. You can see the full list on the SHS website if you like. The ministry created also a Sarawak Heritage Council comprising both government officials as well as private individuals who had concerns and expertise in heritage. I am privileged to be one of those members. Obviously, you would have heard that we opened the Borneo Cultures Museum in 2022, or earlier this year. And this and other special focus museums, let me show you a picture of them, basically exemplify the attention that Sarawak has been paying to its various historical and heritage artifacts. Sarawak Museum, Chinese Museum, Islamic Heritage Museum, the Brooke Gallery at Fort Margherita, the Tun Juga Foundation, which is a great display of weaving techniques for the Wakumbu, as well as a gallery of beads and other artifacts. And don't forget the Sarawak Cultural Village, which is in effect a living museum that you can go in and observe various forms of intangible cultural heritage, as well as see replicas of traditional dwellings, some of which I mentioned earlier, of the different ethnic groups in Sarawak. We have also done various conservation projects, Old Court House in the last 10 or 15 years. The various forts in Sarawak have been conserved, are also in the process of being conserved. The Brooke Dockyard is in progress in converting it into a maritime museum, I believe. The Mill Hill Block is in Joseph School. So some of these are government-led, some of these are private-led, some of these are joint. And there are also various initiatives to promote intangible cultural heritage like Wakumbu, Songket, Keringkam, and so forth. And I mentioned already the Sarawak Cultural Village. Semonggok Wildlife Center has been around ever since 1975, doing good work in preserving an environment for wildlife, rehabilitating orangutans, for instance, and also it's a very good spot for visitors to Sarawak to observe the natural wildlife and to see what is being done to protect it. So what should we do? These are the things we've done already. What more should we do? I guess, to me, it's always about reminding Sarawakians of the value of their heritage. Heritage appreciation should move beyond that feeling of feel good and how beautiful our heritage is towards a community willingness to act. Whenever you see any of our heritage being interfered with or damaged or not well treated, then you should say out something. And you have organizations like Sarawak Heritage Society and others who would be happy to represent your views and to research more on the topic. And there's a real urgency to act to protect our heritage, because when heritage goes down, destroyed, it can happen very suddenly. Think of the Notre Dame example, think of the drinking horse, think of the Satot Suspension Bridge. It's just overnight. Heritage conservation may go against short-term economic interests, but on the whole, it's crucial for the long-term success of Sarawak. Sustainable heritage management requires three legs of a stool, I would say: the clarity of your policy and strategy, your legal and institutional frameworks, and effective enforcement. What specifically should we do in each of the three areas of built heritage, intangible heritage, and natural heritage? Well, I guess we have spoken about the enforcing of the Sarawak Heritage Ordinance. No point having an ordinance if you do not enforce the clauses within it. I think we should go around and include more heritage sites and more heritage buildings in the Heritage Register. But just putting it on a list doesn't mean anything if you do not develop a conservation management plan for each and every one of those items, meaning that having put it on your Heritage Register and gazetted it, you now have a plan. How are you going to preserve, maintain, repair it when it's required? More heritage specialists are required, obviously. I think we are still quite short of heritage architects, for instance, and other heritage practitioners. We have always advocated that heritage impact assessment should be done before any development project, just as EIA or environmental impact assessment is done today. It should be a requirement to see that before you develop a project or develop an area, you should have a study to see whether are you disturbing or interfering with any heritage sites surrounding in the neighborhood of the area. And I talk about innovative business models because when you have lots of new heritage items, heritage buildings, for instance, you need a way to maintain it, to run it, to make sure it's in good shape. And that could be in the form of having organizations, could be private organizations, could be families adopting it and maintaining it for the state. It could be repurposing it, adaptive reuse. We need to think of funding, incentives, and so forth. In terms of intangible cultural heritage, the first thing is to get more of the community engaged in trying to preserve and document their own heritage. It's about inventorizing it to start off with so that we know what we're talking about. We know what's the list of intangible cultural heritage because it's huge. It's huge. And unless you try to list or document it, you don't know how huge it is. And, And, after you inventorize it, you have a list, you start assigning different groups to document it. And obviously after that is to plan initiatives that will safeguard, if possible, specific ICH domains. And for natural heritage, I'm not the natural heritage expert. All I can say is get more involved with the agencies that are helping to protect our natural heritage. We all have a role to play. It's not just the government, although the government needs to lead with ordinance enforcement, legislation, and have a structured strategy and a proactive government intervention to make sure that we arrive at successful and sustainable heritage protection. There is a big role for the private sector who should consider heritage protection as a viable cause to champion, just as they are championing this, some of them are championing this series of talks, perhaps as CSR, corporate social responsibility, perhaps as, adopting a heritage building and doing the right things to renovate it, to conserve it. NGOs such as SHS and others who are involved in heritage have multiple roles, basically to raise awareness, to do advocacy work, to document in certain areas, to be a heritage watch or alert whenever we see or the community informs us of something that's not right happening to a heritage site. In effect, essentially being an agent of change. And the community, each and every one of us, have a role to speak out when and whenever we spot examples of damage or negative impact inflicted on any aspect of our heritage. I think this is one of my last slides. I think reflecting on all this, Lucas Chin has spoken about heritage being endangered way back in '87. We are now almost 40 years hence. Why is heritage management so difficult to do? Well, we have reflected on it many times, and it is a complex and difficult challenge. And some of the reasons why it is complex and difficult are listed in this. I don't intend to go through in detail, but I think a few are worth bearing out. In number one, for instance, in multicultural Sarawak, many cultures, many ethnic groups, the values that different communities or individuals ascribe to heritage items can vary. One community may say item A is important, community B may say B is important. So from a state angle, when you're part of the government, you need to prioritize which projects you do first, and that can be a complex exercise. Who do you prioritize? The communities tend to focus on short-term, or what you call bread and butter issues of making a ringgit tomorrow, how to earn my keep. And this can clash with long-term statewide efforts towards sustainable heritage management. Another one could be private owners of built heritage, private owners who own buildings or sites which are considered heritage, may resist measures curtailing what they see as their basic owner rights when government imposes rules on them that you cannot do this to your building and so forth. They say, who are you to tell me what I can do when this is my building? So unless we are clear in legislation and in bylaws and guidelines what can and cannot be done, or what is suggested to be done or not, we will have difficulty in this area. Number 6 is important, I think, because I think we observe a silo effect, both within government and in non-government agencies, in that we have many, many different groups working for the same cause of heritage protection and heritage management. But very often we work in silos. We don't talk to each other that much. And I think that's something that we need to remedy, and something that we, even in SHS, we acknowledge ourselves, so that if we are able to galvanize and pull together all these disparate resources and talents and passion from the different agencies together, think of how much more that we can do to preserve our heritage. So with that, allow me just one slide to talk about Sarawak Heritage Society, of which I'm currently the president. It's a non-partisan, non-governmental and non-profit organization founded in 2006. We have just over 120, 130 members. We focus more on cultural heritage, both tangible and intangible. And our activities are in areas of what I call the 3 A's: awareness, advocacy, and advisory. Awareness meaning that we basically try to raise the awareness of the community on what heritage is and why it's important to protect our heritage. Advocacy, whenever we see something that's not done right to our heritage within Sarawak, we are a voice that can speak out to highlight the issue. And advisory, basically, we hope to have, over time, built a pool of expertise or competencies, or if not, to link up with other people in other places who have the expertise, so that we can be an advisory of sorts to agencies, whether in government or private sector, or individuals who want advice on how heritage management should be done. And we all the time, we engage with government, with private sector, with academia, and with the community. So with that, I think I have a closing message, I think, for each and every one of you to take away and do after this talk. I guess it would be teach your children about heritage, because if heritage is about passing down something to your next generation, what could be better than teaching them about their heritage, teaching them about what's important, why is it important, and having them nurture a passion in heritage so that they will continue to propagate it to future generations. And with that, I thank you very much. If you have further questions, of course, you can email me. My email is here. And if you want more information about the Sarawak Heritage Society and its activities, our website is there, and feel free to contact us.
Thank you so much, James. That was just a wonderful presentation, comprehensive. It brought back many memories for me. And I think it will be very interesting. It would have been very interesting for our viewers. We haven't got a lot of time left. And you have covered, actually, we've had a few questions, and you have actually covered in your talk the answers to some of those questions. So I'm going to sort of take a privilege to myself and ask the first question. And that is, in your opinion, what do you, in your opinion, are the most endangered buildings in Sarawak at present? And I've primed you on this before, so I hope we can see the slides that you've prepared.
Okay, I think I need to share my screen again, right?
Yes, that's it. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, endangered buildings. I would rather say that these are 2 buildings that we have some concerns about, and we think, we hope more will be done. And Sarawak Heritage has reached out and to the people who are involved in this to say that we want to work with them in order to see what can be done. The first one is the St. James Church, which I mentioned earlier, is in Kampong Kuop. It is, if not the oldest Anglican church in Sarawak, at least the second oldest, the other one being St. Paul's in Banting. This particular church, St. James, was built in 1865. So you think about it, it's Raja James Brooke's era. So it's about 157, 158 years old. It's located just in Kampong Kuop, about 10 to 15 miles from Kuching. It's almost fully made of Balian wood, and a lot of it is still standing. It's an example of one of the earliest. We think of prefabricated construction projects, and we think it's a very modern thing. But actually, Bishop McDougall was one of those who spearheaded this thing where you could build certain parts of this Kampong Kuop Church or St. James Church and actually transport it to the location, and they assemble it there. Some work, obviously, a lot of work was done there, but a lot was also done in Kuching and other places where the carpenters were available. What happened today is that the community in Kampong Kuop have found that because of the state of the structure, they have actually built a new church almost next to the existing St. James Church Kuop, and they are carrying out most of their church services in the new church. But they have chosen to retain this church because of its historical value, but they only hold very light activities in it, And I think it's high time that we pay more attention to this church, especially now that it has been gazetted, to go in and do a structural review of it and to see what needs to be done. You can see the interior in some of the pictures on the screen. You can see the altar, you can see the decoration within there, and it's still a very beautiful church if it's restored right, And so we are not sure what's going to happen to it, and this is one of the areas that we are, as a society, will be paying attention to. So that's the first one. The second one is the Old Hokkien School, which I think I also spoke about earlier, constructed in 1911 through the initiative of prominent Hokkien community leaders. And the architecture is a blend of colonial influence taste of the period. And it's got a lot of links to the history of China and the history of education in Sarawak. And I think that's very significant. And it was called the Hokkien Free School at that time because education was free to the students who qualified. And it really laid the foundation for Chinese education in Sarawak. Again, we are talking to the groups who own this building, primarily the Hokkien Association and others. And at the moment, the building is unoccupied and in somewhat state of disrepair, but still appears to be structurally sound, although we need professionals to take a look at that and to see what needs to be retained. So, Puan Sri, these are the two examples that come to mind. I wouldn't call them endangered strictly, but I think there are areas that of concern that I think we should go in and pay some more attention to.
Yes. Thank you, James. I will continue with a question. There have been several questions from Frank Saying, and I think you partly answered this one, but he was asking for your opinion on the latest Sarawak Heritage Ordinance, which you mentioned, of 1919, and what are the key challenges to Sarawak's heritage today? Could you give us a brief answer, please?
The Sarawak Heritage Ordinance 2019 was only enacted on the 1st of March this year, although it passed through the Dun 2 years ago, just before the pandemic. And I think the key features there, over and above what the previous ordinance had, are, I guess, 3 or 4 things. The first one is that it creates a Sarawak Heritage Fund. It makes allowance for the state to provide a certain fund which will be used for heritage activities, whether to promote the conservation of a certain heritage or to document or to do other things like that. So that's important because prior to this, we never had a formal fund. The second one is I created a Sarawak Heritage Council, which I mentioned before. And I think this is good because it's now opening to the wider community for advice and their perspectives of what can be done to preserve our heritage better. The third one is that now it encompasses underwater heritage. The previous ordinances did not protect underwater heritage. And, in Sarawak history, we have known of many ships which have sunk, and those are not protected by law in the past. So you can have salvagers going in, taking stuff from there, and you couldn't stop them because they were in their legal rights. But now we have, well, better late than never, have underwater heritage being preserved. Yeah. And I think there's more mention of intangible heritage, although we wish it could be even more, but I think previous ordinances focused primarily on tangible heritage. Now we have at least mentions of intangible heritage, although I think we need more guidelines and rules to go further into what intangible heritage we can protect. So I would say those are the 4 key features. There are refinements in most of the clauses. There are a lot more clauses than before, but if you want me to highlight 4 areas, those would be the 4. And I think it's something that we can work with and improve over time. And I think it will have an impact on our heritage management.
Thank you, James. And that is somewhat connected with a question that has come in. And this question, and I'm reading it, does the Sarawak government have a budget post for heritage conservation? And if yes, how many % of the total budget does this represent?
I'm not too clear of the exact percentage, but we have only had very few Heritage Council meetings. But what has been talked about has been in the region of R1 million for heritage, but we have been told, we have been assured that more funds are available when proposals are put forward, and we can have tangible projects of which we need to allocate resources to. We have been assured by the minister himself that funds are available. It's a matter of scoping and putting in the proposal what you are trying to preserve.
Reassuring. Thank you. And I have another question here from Mike Quay. How do you view the role of the Damai Cultural Village in conservation practice? Would you like to elaborate on that?
I think I mentioned a little bit about the Sarawak Cultural Village at Damai. I think what it calls itself a living museum is very apt, very appropriate. I think because as we have seen in the examples I've shared, there will be instances whereby we will not be able to preserve a certain building because it's just of not meaningful or not functional to the current community. So the only way for us to retain a memory of that is to do perhaps a replica, or maybe even transport that old building over to the Sarawak Cultural Village. Or there could be more villages like the Sarawak Cultural Village, but I think we have one at the moment, which is doing very well. And I think this provides the community as well as visitors to Sarawak an opportunity to learn about what was around before, even if they can't see it today in the location that it once was. It's better than nothing. And the other aspect, of course, we have a lot of people who have worked in the Sarawak Cultural Village who performed or showcase various intangible culture, such as dancers, such as art and culture, and so forth. So it's a very good place that basically anchors and in one spot so that visitors can find it convenient to see what's available.
There's one very interesting comment here, which I'd like to read out. Given current concerns with decolonization within Western institutions, is there any inherent conflict with your ambitions to preserve colonial assets within Sarawak?
Very good question. And I'm glad the questioner brought up this point, because we have obviously all observed the whole movement of decolonization around the world, even up to toppling of statues of people in certain places. I think, to me, first of all, history is history. What has happened, and nothing you and I can do can change it. Whether you agree or disagree, it's part of history. The Brooks were here for 105 years, and there were positives as well as negatives, depending again on which community you represent. But nonetheless, I think we need to document our history the way it happened. I think in the past, most history books were written by the West, the Westerners. I think in the current last 50 years, perhaps, more and more history books are being written by locals to showcase the local perspective. And that's the way it should be. At some time, we would probably have a more balanced perspective, Westerners versus locals. And from there, the reader can make his or her own judgment as to what is the truth, right? And I think yes, some may criticize certain activities that the Brooks or the colonials or whatever did to Sarawak, which were negative to their community or whatever. But I think equal amount of people can also point to positive activities and positive results that we benefited from the reign, 104 years reign, or the colony time. And even for myself, for instance, would there ever have been a St. Joseph's school that I attended and Puan taught at?
Very good.
Had it not been for this colonial effect or the Brook effect? I don't know. I can't answer that question, but I know I'm a product of that, and I am thankful for that.
Thank you, James. Well, our session has been almost 1.5 hours, so I think it's probably almost time to wrap up. I just want to say that Sarawak is such a big state, and perhaps not everybody knows that Sarawak on its own is as big as the peninsula minus Perlis, which is a very small state. Added to that, it's a very rural state. It's not easy to access. It's not like Malacca, where you could probably go around in half a day. We've got difficulties of communication, vast interior, and that makes it a challenge for heritage conservation. James has concentrated mainly on Kuching, and probably quite rightly, because I think most of our heritage buildings is in Kuching. Obviously, our intangible heritage is much more widespread. We haven't got time to go into all sorts of things. I think this has been a wonderful series. We've looked at Longhouse tradition, the regattas, the brook forts, the weaving, and of course food. And we've ended up today with the endangered heritage. We could only focus on some aspects of it. Those of us who know Sarawak, we know that we have a great treasure. We're different from other states. We're different from Sabah, and we're completely different from the peninsula. And it's just with James's presentation, he brought this very much to our attention, and I thank him very much for his presentation today, because he's outlined a whole host of things and made us very much aware of what we have and also what we should do to keep what we have. And I thank you very much, James, for this. I think with a lot of regret, I'm supposed to officially close this series, but not before thanking our major supporter, Petra Energy Berhad, and our other donors, Creator Foundation, Cahaya Mata Sarawak Berhad, Cope Private Equity Sendirian Berhad, and Centric PR Sendirian Berhad. We're grateful to all of you. And with that, I would hand over to Vanessa, whom you may not know is a Sarawakian as well. She's from Miri. So really, this is an in-house presentation. Vanessa, over to you.
Thank you very much, Puan Liz, for being our captivating and gracious moderator for today's talk, and for your kind and inspiring words as we conclude Badan Warisan Malaysia's Spotlight on Sarawak series for 2022. Thank you very much, James, for sharing your knowledge and giving us a deeper glimpse of Sarawak's diverse heritage. I know that there is so much more that you wish you could have covered, and unfortunately there was a time limit today. And you've covered not only the built and tangible heritage, but the intangible too. You have highlighted what is at stake, made us aware of the challenges, and we hope more of us will be able to carry out some of your excellent detailed suggestions on what we can personally do to be actively involved to preserve our heritage. For our audience, thank you very much for tuning in for today's talk and for all your comments and questions. We are grateful that many of you have been following our webinar series on Spotlight on Sarawak. And thank you for the encouraging and positive feedback. We truly appreciate your support and participation. Please follow Badan Warisan Malaysia on our website. You can subscribe to our e-newsletter, Jendela Warisan, or follow us on Facebook and Instagram for more information on upcoming events or news on heritage in Malaysia. As we've mentioned, the videos for each of the 6 talks will be available in a few weeks, and we will announce it in our social media. We are organizing 2 webinars on Art Deco architecture that will be held on the 28th of July and 4th August at 6:30 p.m. Malaysia time. For more information, please check out our website and social media, and we will post information on how to register for these 2 upcoming webinars soon. Badan Warisan Malaysia is an independent non-government organization, and we do not receive any financial support from the government. If you have enjoyed today's talk and wish to support our educational and advocacy work, please donate to Badan Warisan Malaysia. Details are available here on the screen. Thank you very much in advance for your kind support. On behalf of Badan Warisan Malaysia, we wish to express appreciation to our donors, supporters, and the team behind our Spotlight on Sarawak series. Thank you once again for your support, and we wish you a lovely evening.